Everything is going well for a serial womanizer who casually sleeps with different ladies. However, that changes when he meets an elderly woman who decides to teach him a lesson. A boy, having moved to the USA at age 10, got picked on by a classmate with a mock game of 52 pickup. As the boy picked up the cards, he felt for a pretty girl who helped him. Sadly, his heart was crushed when he found out the girl was going out with his mean classmate. In the present, the boy has grown up to be rather famous, being interviewed for his book called 52 Pickup. The female interviewer cites the book's claims of teaching men to pick up a different woman every week for a year. The man confidently boils it down to 3 rules to activate such a feat, which the interviewer finds degrading. However, she ends up in bed with the man later on. The man beds multiple women of varying personalities. Later, at a signing event for his new book, the man, Edison Eddie Greenleaf, entertains male fans who gush about how his book changed their lives. Eddie projects a warm personality, but is rude and judgmental underneath. Afterward, Eddie and his agent and best friend, Steve, make fun of the fans while publishing agent Molly criticizes their ungratefulness. The bookstore owner, Nana, comes over and flirts with Eddie, to his dismay. Once the signing event ends, Steve invites Eddie to a charity fashion show, enticing him with the celebrity models in attendance. Eddie agrees and makes fun of Steve as the agent reminds him of the release party that night, and then he drives off. That night, Eddie arrives strutting at the glitzy release event when an elderly woman with unsightly features gets in his way. The woman gets into Eddie's disrespect for women, but he doesn't take her seriously. Then, the woman asks for a kiss to prove that Eddie can see the beauty underneath every woman, but he rudely refuses and leaves. The old woman then points her huge walking stick at Eddie's back. At the party, Steve tries to flirt with Molly, but she dismisses him and walks off. Meanwhile, Eddie cuts off his conversation with a lady to approach a long-haired woman getting a lot of attention. Eddie talks to the long-haired woman named Alexa, but his shrewd comments cause her to become insecure, leading her to invite him to her place. Eddie ends up going back to Alexa's place and sleeping with her. The next morning, he walks over to the bathroom and discovers to his shock that he is now a woman. Eddie even peeks inside his undergarment for good measure. Eddie sneaks out of the house, but not before he gives Alexa a scare. Inside his car, Eddie calls Steve, who doesn't recognize the female voice on the other end. He tricks his agent into coming over to his house with the promise of a 3-way, and Steve eagerly agrees. Later, at Eddie's house, Steve arrives and excitedly introduces himself to the attractive woman who lets him inside. Female Eddie tries to convince Steve of the inexplicable transformation, but the agent grows suspicious and decides to call the cops. Eddie mentions names and events only he and Steve would know, but the latter remains skeptical. He finally convinces him he's Eddie by reluctantly recounting a Vegas incident where they got handsy with each other. When asked how it happened, Eddie merely recalls his escapade the previous night with Alexa before Steve starts hitting on him. The sleazy agent fantasizes about Eddie in swimwear, but gets smacked back to reality, with Eddie saying they need to figure out what happened. Steve retraces Eddie's activities in the last 24 hours until the latter remembers the old woman asking for a kiss, saying he blew her off. The agent says the woman might have been a witch, and Eddie suggests finding her to make her change him back to a man. With no time to waste, Eddie and Steve go to a shelter for homeless people, approaching the receptionist Tanya and misleading her into thinking they're looking for a thief. She gets angry at this, and the manager, Jess White, cuts in to introduce herself and asks what's happening. Calling himself Edna Greenleaf, Eddie tells Jess about how the old woman stole his identity and describes her physical features, including having a wand-like walking stick. Edna and Steve later walk out of the shelter grumpily once their request gets rejected. After visiting 5 shelters, the two return to Eddie or Edna's home without any clue about the old woman's whereabouts. Steve encourages a grumpy Edna by telling her to embrace being a woman in the meantime, adding that it may be a good time to do a little research for her next book. The next day, Steve takes Edna shopping for women's clothes at a store. The agent introduces his friend as his sister and proceeds to ogle the attendant's chest. Edna steps out of the dressing room complaining in skimpy undergarments, and Steve voices out his attraction for his sister, grossing out the attendant. Later at a salon, Steve introduces Edna to the proprietor, who introduces them to his partner and one of the stylists, James. After a day of shopping, Edna and Steve return to the former's house. The agent invites Edna for a drink at the GC Marketplace restaurant with Molly later, which Edna reluctantly agrees to. On the way to the gym the next day, Edna goes into the men's locker room to catcalls and general rudeness and walks right back out. She then goes to the women's locker room, enjoying the sight of all the undressed women before getting approached by a blonde woman. The blonde asks her to put some lotion on her back, to Edna's glee. At the GC Marketplace that night, Steve walks into Molly, flirting with Frank Stallone. Steve tries flirting with Molly as well, but she flat out rejects him. Edna then arrives, catching the eye of everybody in the restaurant and eventually meeting a surprised Molly and Steve. She introduces herself to Molly as Eddie's sister, Edna, while Steve agonizes over her sloppy makeup. Molly helps Edna fix her makeup and rejoins Steve at the bar after. Edna notices Jess from the homeless shelter sitting alone and decides to greet her as Molly leaves an annoying Steve. Edna introduces herself to Jess, who remembers her looking for the old woman who stole her ID. They get into a friendly chat and Jess accidentally assumes Edna is flirting with her, stating she's straight. Jess further laments that it's been a while since anybody hit on her, and Edna tells her to have confidence. Still unsure of herself, Jess gets into drinking with Edna. Moments later, Edna convinces an overthinking Jess to go and talk to one of the guys at the bar. Jess awkwardly makes small talk with a guy named Dylan, but he dismisses her in favor of the baseball game on television. Edna then approaches and expertly flirts with Dylan, humiliates him with a splash of martini to the face, then leaves laughing with Jess. Outside the restaurant, Jess drunkenly rants about men being superficial, to which Edna agrees. When Jess throws up on the sidewalk, Edna decides to take her to her place. The next day, Edna goes into an adult toy store where she seeks help from twin attendants Dill and Doe at shopping for a solo toy, where she meets Matt, a fellow shopper. Edna gets into a friendly chat with Matt, who leaves her a calling card. Edna later recounts the meeting to Steve and Mal setting up Matt with Jess. Steve wonders how she even met an investment banker like Matt. Edna admits to shopping at the adult store and shows her agent the toy she bought for experimental purposes. Later, at the homeless shelter, Edna tells Jess she's setting her up for a blind date. Jess refuses at first, but Edna thinks of a way to improve her chances. Edna takes Jess to the stylist, James, who promises to give her a stellar makeover. Jess goes around shopping and getting pedicures with Edna, eventually asking her why she isn't setting her up with her brother, Eddie. Edna leads Jess into thinking that Eddie is in prison for committing fraud, alluding to her male version's tendency for deception. Afterward, at home, Edna calls Steve and informs him she wants to take Eddie's place in the fashion show. On their way to the GC the next evening, Edna reminds Jess of their code word bananas if she and Matt hit it off. Edna later introduces her to Matt, leaving the two at the table while she gets drinks. She rebuffs an advance from the guy manning the counter by saying she's got male bits and rejoins Jess and Matt, who seem to be getting along. Edna notices something off with Matt when he talks about volunteering for shelters. However, Jess mentions the code word, prompting Edna to leave the two to their date. The next day, Edna expresses doubts about setting Jess up with Matt to a bewildered Steve. When Edna finds distaste for tricking women into getting laid, Steve points out how she wrote 2 manuals on the subject. Edna goes on to rethink the merits of a committed relationship, and highlights how Jess is different from the women she dated when she was still a man. Steve exclaims Edna, or Eddie, is falling in love with Jess and starts teasing his friend until he gets hit in the head by a ball. That night, Edna visits Jess at her house, and they drink wine while Jess gets in the bathtub. When Edna finds out Jess and Matt are meeting again, she warns her of the snake-like nature of men. Jess, however, wonders why Edna didn't go for Matt, but Edna says she likes someone else, with a lingering glance at Jess. The next day, Edna goes to the office address on Matt's card, soon running into employees coming out of the office. She finds out from the 2 employees that Matt is married with 3 kids. Later, Edna relays her discovery to Steve, who thinks the old Eddie would have been pleased with Matt's tactics. Edna replies that her new self would despise her old self, to which Steve disagrees but admits to the complicated nature of the situation. At the charity fashion show the following night, Jess meets Edna backstage. She gushes about Matt, who is currently out of town, much to Edna's disdain. Edna blurts out that Matt is married and thinks Jess should be with someone who cares about her. Jess accuses her of being a lesbian, at which point Edna retells the story of how the old woman changed her into her current female body. Disgusted at Edna's ridiculous-sounding story, Jess warns Edna against ever contacting her before storming off. A distraught Edna later walks down the runway with tears and makeup dripping down her face. Later, at her place, Edna hashes out her feelings to Steve, who finds it hard to relate to his friend's current emotional state. While bonding over drinks, Edna decides to ask Steve to do the deed with her, much to the latter's delight. While waiting for Edna to freshen up, Steve hears a scream from the bathroom. He finds Edna covered with blood, screaming for him to call 911. Afterward, Steve thanks the departing EMTs for the tampon for Edna's period. He then talks to a grateful Edna, who agrees to scrap their planned activity before bidding her friend goodbye. The next day, at the GC, Edna calls out a guy for hitting on her at the counter. She denounces scamming women to get them into bed and says only love matters as a female customer agrees. As she leaves, the attendant tells the rude guy he should be relieved as Edna has male beds. Edna proceeds to write a new book, which she submits to Steve. Steve contracts the sincere and emotional themes with her previous work. However, Edna stands by her newfound belief that intimacy is only special when love is involved. Later, Edna walks past the old woman with the stick, who notices her and blows her a magical kiss unnoticed. The next day, Edna wakes up to urinate and discovers she's changed back into a man, overjoyed at the urine spraying upward. He then calls Steve to relay the news as the mowing guy spots him in ladies' undergarments. Months later, at a signing event for his new book, Eddie humbly greets a line of female fans, a stark change from his previous player attitude. Afterward, he congratulates Steve and Molly on their 6-month anniversary together and refuses Molly's offer of a blind date. Just then, Jess shows up with Eddie's book, touched that he dedicated it to her. She still finds it unbelievable that Eddie and Edna are one and the same, so Eddie reintroduces himself as a gesture of starting over. They catch up by alluding to their past relationships and experiences, agree to go on a coffee date, and leave the bookstore while holding hands.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.